There are many definitions of sustainability. Here at Sembcorp, sustainability is safeguarding the future. To us, that future is bright. We harness the power of the sun and wind, design low-carbon sustainable solutions for green urban cities, and lay the foundation for generations to come. Sustainability is innovation, challenging the norms and leading disruption. We innovate to solve complex global problems. We use our experiences to create opportunities from challenges. Sustainability is about the communities. We care for the communities and aim to improve their quality of life. We forge strong partnerships and leverage our platforms in the region to deliver sustainable solutions. Our success is founded upon the trust from the communities we serve. Sustainability is about our people. Our success is bolstered by the strength and energy of one Sembcorp team, a team that can thrive in the current and future world. Sustainability is not just a catchphrase. To us, sustainability is our business.
Net Zero COP, trade opportunities on the journey to decarbonising ASEAN. My name's Tim Rockwell and I'm chairman of the Energy and Utilities Business Group in Singapore. It's a real pleasure to be with you. I'd like to confirm the British Chamber of Commerce is the first carbon neutral chamber, and we're absolutely committed to developing commercial partnerships that will support regional ambitions. We're going to be providing you with insights across scaling up in Asia, a session on hydrogen and carbon capture in the region, another session on finance and risk revolution, and then we'll have a wrap up at the end. This session's a culmination of the work that we've done this year, looking at financing carbon capture and storage in the region, looking at scaling out sustainable solutions, battery storage, and data centers. And we're absolutely delighted again to be running this think tank at the Singapore International Energy Week 2021, and what a week it's been. We're going to start with two keynote sessions, and I'm very pleased to be joined by Tom Moody, who's the Regional Director, Climate and Energy of the UK Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office based at the British High Commission here in Singapore, and Simon Wild, who's Director, Analysis and Assurance at Ofgem, which is the British regulator. So I'm going to have a fireside chat with Tom and Simon, but I'm going to let them first just deliver short keynote addresses to really set the scene as to, first of all, what's happening in the region, and then what some of the exciting things that are happening in the United Kingdom. So with that, I'm going to hand straight away over to Tom. Thank you, Tom.
Thanks, Tim, and it's a real pleasure to be here and talk Singapore International Energy Week alongside Simon with the Chamber. So if we could just go to the next slide, please. Thank you. I think the first point I wanted to just dwell on was that it's a really crucial moment, 3 days from COP kicking off in Glasgow. And we know that's a really critical meeting because the IPCC report and other scientific evidence has been very clear that it is increasingly stark that this is the crucial decade to take action. So we have to succeed. And what does that mean? Well, if we can go to the next slide, I'll give you a sense of what the COP presidency is trying to achieve with that. Next slide, please. So at its heart, our goal here is to keep 1.5 degrees alive, the commitment at the very heart of the Paris Agreement. And we need to do that by bending the emissions curve as fast as possible. We're already seeing, as your audience will have seen, including here in Singapore, lots of disruption already to lives and livelihoods by just a 1 degree rise with unprecedented climate change, and we really need to tackle that now. So the UK presidency is responsible for bringing two major things together to achieve that. First is we need to finalise the rules around the Paris Agreement, and that's the negotiations. And that particularly means things like international carbon trading, the timeframes for ratcheting up ambition. So if you look at Paris as the moment of promise, this is the moment of reality where the rubber hits the road. But we need to do that as well by bringing those commitments to life in the real world. And that's why we've been focusing on 4 areas to achieve 1.5 degrees around the areas I've listed on the right there. So, for example, what that looks like is we need to phase out coal as early as possible. We need to peak emissions. We need to ensure that around 50% of international climate finance is spent on adaptation. And a really crucial totemic issue for COP26 is the $100 billion commitment from the developed world to finance and support the needs of the developing world in adapting and mitigating climate change. So around the world, let me just give you a snapshot of the progress that we've been making. So I feel proud to say that under the UK presidency, we've seen, for example, net zero commitments rise from 30% of global GDP to 80% going into COP26. And under our G7 presidency, which coincides with the COP26 presidency, our June summit in Cornwall saw all G7 countries commit to net zero by no later than 2050. So we're working hard also with the COP26 partners, Italy, in their G20 presidency to see a similar outcome from that starting at the weekend. Our analysis shows that if the G20 get on board with this, we can keep that 1.5 degree really within reach and in touching distance. And we really welcome, of course, China's announcement at the UN General Assembly that they will become the last major financer of coal overseas and ending that practice soon. In this region, we've seen some really positive announcements in the last 9 months. For example, Indonesia, Laos, and Malaysia have all now set net zero dates. And there's been great commitments from the Philippines, Indonesia, and Malaysia on coal phase out. And Singapore, of course, on regional energy trading. And there's some fantastic announcements this week here at SEW taking that forward further. So there's much more to do, I think. And the UN report this week made very clear and stark that the gap between those long-term political goals and the 2030 plans, the nationally determined contributions, remains big. But we've got that cause for optimism in terms of the long-term targets. So next slide, please. What's behind that momentum and what can we take from it? Well, firstly, I think, like most of the world, the perceptions in this region have changed markedly over the last couple of years. So that is based, I think, on the science around the risks and the costs of not taking action, but also about the benefits in terms of innovation and competitiveness. So that picture on the left there shows you across ASEAN, the perceptions of the public and business, that there are really great opportunities in terms of that innovation and competitiveness piece from going further in addressing climate change and mitigating it. Secondly, in the middle there is the innovation and scaling of technologies over the last 10 years have really driven down the costs. So in all 10 ASEAN countries, it'll be cheaper, by the end of this decade to build new solar than it will be to operate all existing coal plants. So if you're an economics finance minister in a region like Southeast Asia, with economies connected to global value chains, you will want to make sure you're providing the most competitively priced energy for those factories and businesses you're looking to attract investment from. And thirdly, on the right there, of course, is the economics have become even more convincing. And important there, I think, is as we're starting to think increasingly about the recovery from the pandemic, we need to also be focusing every cent of public investment on where it will have the most bang for buck. So my key message here, I think, is that we're positioning ourselves well to build on the momentum of Glasgow and see those factors sustain us past a tipping point. So let me just say a few words about the post-COP period and what we hope will be our legacy during our presidency year. So the UK has a vision to be one of the leading players in this global green industrial revolution that I've just talked about. And it's taking measures itself to drive that within a 10-point plan domestically. And we've announced further measures this week on a net zero strategy, which is really our long-term strategy for delivering that commitment. And we're doing that both to secure our own decarbonisation commitments, which we've legislated for by 2050, while also ensuring we maximise the trade opportunities and economic opportunities and connections around the world. And that means not just leadership, but also pioneering the technologies in the UK to support the rapid scale up and innovation to deploy around the world. And the Global Green Investment Summit, the Prime Minister led last week in the UK, showed some pretty impressive success already with that. So we've attracted nearly 20 billion Singapore dollars worth of foreign investment into those areas, including from Singapore into everything from offshore wind to batteries. So we're focusing all that domestic expertise and development to make the link to collaboration overseas with our partners, including as ASEAN's newest dialogue partner. And over the last 10 years, I'm proud to say that our climate finance, UK Development Climate Finance, has avoided or reduced as much CO2 emissions as taking nearly 7 million cars off the road for a year. And we're doubling that commitment to around 20 billion Singapore dollars over the 5 years to 2025. It will be a key part of our increased presence in the Indo-Pacific region as we tilt towards that, including with the G7 work we've begun. So our firms of all sizes are already supporting that transition across the region, including areas such as developing hydrogen strategies, supporting offshore wind, green finance taxonomies and voluntary carbon markets. And they're bringing that expertise that they've developed in the UK and around this region to the region. So this topic, I think, of trade opportunities and decarbonisation is absolutely the right one to be thinking about now on the eve of COP, as we enter that recovery phase from the pandemic. So that spirit is very much in the heart of our vision for the opportunities in the UK, and it's something which the UK government will be placing at the very heart of our relationships with Singapore and this vital region during our presidency year and the years following that. Thanks very much, Tim. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Tom, and it's great that you could join us and set the scene there. And please stay online because we'll ask you some questions in the fireside chat. I'm going to go straight to Simon Wild, Director of Analysis and Assurance at Ofgem, based in the UK, for his opening comments. And I'm really pleased that you can join us, Simon. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Tim, and it's great to see you again. And it's great to be back at Energy Week after last year's events. My only regret is that it's still, for me at least, not in person. And hopefully we can fix that next year. Although we were saying that this time last year. Just building on Tom's comments, with which I completely agree, I wanted to say three things. One was how we see COP26 fitting into our thinking as the UK energy regulator. Secondly, giving you a few examples of developments that build on what we've been doing, but that we're really looking to accelerate in a post COP26 world. And then finally, just reflecting, like Tom did, on sort of what the next steps are going to be after COP26. So for us, COP26 is a key milestone. The UK government has reconfirmed its existing commitment to net zero, but the government's really put some flesh on the bones of its plans to deliver net zero. And in the net zero strategy that Tom alluded to, there is a clear commitment to the electricity sector being fully net zero by 2035. And that's going to have some profound implications, which I'll touch on. Decarbonising the electricity sector well ahead of 2050 also creates a platform for the decarbonisation of heat and transportation through electrification. And there are strategies for the electrification and decarbonisation, as I said, both of transport and now also of heating. And there are some very specific measures for the here and now. So the UK government has announced a new support scheme for the construction of new nuclear, which is a regulatory scheme which Ofgem will administer. Likewise, for carbon capture and storage, we've announced two initial areas where we will develop carbon capture hubs, and the transportation and storage elements of CCUS. There will again be a bespoke regulatory regime to facilitate investment. All of this investment that we expect to see will predominantly come from private capital, as it has done for the last 3 decades, hopefully attracted by support mechanisms and regulatory structures which investors continue to have confidence in. So there's going to be a lot going on. Let me give you some examples. I'll give you an example from upstream, midstream, and downstream. So upstream, we've already seen the removal of coal effectively from the generation mix, with 1 or 2 very small exceptions, and that will go in the next couple of years. Gas, though, is now our predominant generation. We have significant renewables, we have significant nuclear, but gas is the largest source. Gas-fired power stations, as they run today, are incompatible with a net zero electricity system by 2035. And therefore, we are undertaking multiple work streams. The first is having carbon capture and storage, as I've just mentioned, so you can still have gas plants, but where the CO2 is captured, used, or stored. Secondly, there is a move to have green hydrogen, and the government is looking at support schemes for electrolysis and other forms of the production of green hydrogen. And then the third possible replacement for gas is long duration storage. And we're currently consulting on what the regulatory and support models will have to be in the coming years. So this is a 1 year, 2 year thing, not long distant future. How do we deploy long duration storage in the UK to complement renewables? So lots going on in the upstream space. In midstream, by which I mean sort of transmission and interconnectors, I just want to mention interconnectors. The UK is a highly interconnected market. We now have 7 interconnectors up and running, the latest of which was only commissioned on the 1st of October this year. So we had 6 last year, and they accounted for 9% of UK consumption. And interconnectors today have got capacity over 7,000 megawatts, and that will increase in future years to over 10,000 megawatts. And we see real benefits of having the UK connected to our European partners and neighbors. And it's interesting to note that of the electricity that flowed into the UK last year from interconnectors, 66% was from zero carbon sources. So it plays an important plank in our decarbonisation strategy. And then in downstream, so in distribution and supply, and echoing what Tom said about the need for innovation, 5 or 6 years ago, we changed the way that we regulate distribution companies to focus on outputs, focus on innovation, and focus on investments. And that was through something we called Rio regulation. We've just reconfirmed that in terms of Rio 2 with a real commitment in strategic innovation funding. And then looking ahead, there are some real challenges here. We need a downstream sector that is fully integrated across the entire value chain and that gives us the flexibility that we need. If electrification of heat and transport just means that our peak loads double or treble, that will not be an optimized system. And we've got a lot of work going on right now as to how the different pieces of the energy system will work together to deliver net zero, but at lowest cost to consumers, because Ofgem's duty remains primarily to current and future consumers. So a lot going on in those 3 areas. Looking forward, and my final point, we're hoping that COP26 will help accelerate dialogue between regulators. We have a great working relationship with the EMA here in Singapore, and we've been building relationships across the globe. And I very much hope that COP26 will see a reinforcement of those links, because we've got so much to learn from each other, which I think is really clear today. If you look at the story of what's going on in ASEAN region and the UK, there are striking parallels, and I look forward to discussing those. Thanks, Tim.
Yeah, thank you, Simon. And we're now going to go to the fireside chat with yourself and bring Tom back into the picture until we get to 1/2 the hour. And when we get on to some of the exciting panels we've got lined up. Well, I like to say always, the UK doesn't just do studies and think about things. We actually walk the talk, right? So we have got test beds that are up and running. We're looking at industrial cluster decarbonisation, and we focused net zero Teesside, I think last year at the same session. But whether it's around clean transport systems, hydrogen, carbon capture, energy storage, we've got test beds running in all of those. So interestingly, we're not just looking at technology, we're looking at business models. But a quick question for you, and I think you want to keep this quite rapid fire, is what technologies are emerging that you think could be implemented at scale fastest? Is it a race, and kind of, are there some that you would pick out from the list that I just gave?
Tim, was that to Tom first for Asia?
I was going to stick with you, Simon.
Of course. So at the moment, we're pursuing what I describe in a multiple choice test as an all of the above strategy. The UK government and the regulator is not looking to pick winners. We're looking to create an environment where we can see multiple technologies emerge. So as you said, carbon capture and storage is going to be absolutely essential. The role it will play in generation will depend upon the emerging role of hydrogen and the emerging role of long duration storage. And we're encouraging both of those too. And then we will let the market decide what the right configuration is to replace gas. But we're on an urgent burning platform. There needs to be a solution by 2035. Likewise, in home heating, we are supporting through innovation funding and trials hydrogen. So in other words, converting existing gas boilers to go from natural gas to CH4 to H2 to hydrogen. But at the same time, we're encouraging and we will be subsidizing, we've announced a subsidy for electric boilers, the electrification of heat. And again, I think we will, policymakers and regulators are looking to facilitate the rapid introduction of technologies, and then we will adjust to make sure that the market can determine which ones will succeed.
That's great. And of course, Ofgem as a partner of EMA, very happy to share some of the findings and learnings in due course, and we can come to that in 2022. Absolutely. Tom, I'm going to switch to you now. And I know you're a very experienced diplomat. You were in Africa before you came to Singapore. Was it 2 years ago or 1 year ago? But time has flown, right?
A year and a half, yeah.
A year and a half, there you go, yeah. I mean, perhaps your reflection, Tom, on kind of what technologies have you seen in the region that might scale fastest? But then I want to ask you to dwell on, what are you seeing different in Southeast Asia, what in the Eastern Hemisphere, to what you've seen before, from the UK? I mean, there are differences in development, there's differences in GDP growth, there's differences, of course, in the units of energy in GDP in this part of the world, in the Eastern Hemisphere. But start with the technologies first. What do you think is going to scale fast? And then where do you see the challenges around what's different in Southeast Asia?
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of technologies, there's a lot of interest in hydrogen I've seen in the region, but I'm not convinced that will scale very quickly. There's lots of interest in Singapore, for example, in hydrogen, but I feel like that is still a way off. I think the areas that are most accessible and therefore likely to see most investment across the wider region are solar and offshore wind, to be frank. And I think the really interesting thing that we've seen more of during this week's SU and of course in the ASEAN leaders meeting in the last few weeks has been the renewed interest in the ASEAN grid. And so it was great to hear Simon's points about the UK experience around that, because I feel like that is an area where we as the UK will want to lean in and follow some of our peers in supporting that work. In terms of your question about progress in Southeast Asia and how it compares to the Western Hemisphere, I mean, I think the big lesson from ASEAN's experience has been a very carbon intensive growth. So allowing us to support them in decoupling growth from carbon intensity is a really important step that we need to work with them on. I mean, I think the UK experience is fantastic on that. We've grown our economy by about 75% in the last 20 years and reduced our emissions by over 40%. So we've shown that can be done. And I think there's a key role for us in supporting ASEAN in decoupling that growth, particularly as they come very rapidly out of the pandemic and start to return to pre-pandemic growth. And I think you've seen that in some of the predictions coming out over the last few months about the scale of that growth returning to sort of 7% levels. I would say that in the region, I mean, I think the paradigm has really shifted in the last year or so away from, I mean, if you came to last year's SU, you would have seen the continued prominence of coal there. And I think we have certainly seen from major announcements by some of the biggest emitters in the region, Indonesia, Philippines, Malaysia, about their moves away from coal, that paradigm is shifting. So I think the interest in a renewables future is certainly there, and I think the opportunities are all to play for.
Cool, thanks Tom, and I know you're going to join us at the wrap-up session sort of at 5:45 Singapore time. I'm going to give the last question of this section to Simon. I was going to ask you, what are the top 3 roles policymakers should be doing to enable public-private, commercially viable driven response to COP26? But given time, maybe we talk about the key thing that regulators and policymakers should be doing. We heard a lot about frameworks at SU, but kind of what would you say is the #1 enabler from a regulatory point of view? And you've probably now got less than a minute to answer that one.
Quite right. I would say stability and certainty. Private capital flourishes when it's given a clear task and the rules of the game don't change. And one of the things that the UK is proud of is that although the country no longer has a AAA rating from Moody's, Moody's rate the stability and predictability of our regulatory regime as AAA, and that's been the bedrock that's underpinned private capital over the last 20 years, and we need an acceleration of that private capital over the next 20 years.
Thank you very much, Simon. And we spoke before the session about interconnectivity, and I think we need another session just specifically on that, given what's come out of Singapore International Energy Week this year. The UK, I think, manages 6 or 7 gigawatts, including the world's longest interconnector. And, there's a big topic at Singapore International Energy Week. So I know you've got to run, Simon, because important policy meetings, but thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you in our programs next year. And thank you, Tom, as well. And we will see you in a little bit. But yeah, thanks, Simon. Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you. So I'm going to hand over straight away to Allard Nui, who is the co-chair of the Energy and Utilities Business Group at BRITCHAM in Singapore. And he will introduce himself and his panel. And we're going to really be looking at kind of how do we scale up in the energy transition. And I know Allard's got tons of experience on that to share with everyone. So that's it from me until a little bit later on in the session. So over to you, Allard.
Thank you very much, Tom, for that very kind introduction. And good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the SU BRITCHAM Singapore Roundtable webinar, in which we will cover indeed Asia's role in the energy transition and scaling up investments in Southeast Asia sustainable infrastructure. The questions which we will be addressing include what are the policy development decisions needed to create energy efficient systems. We will also cover developments in terms of energy storage and the capability of carbon price discovery. The panelists which we've assembled today will share their experiences. And as Tom said, my name is Allard Nui. I'm the co-chair of the Energy and Utilities Business Group at BRITCHAM Singapore, and been based in Singapore since 2013, where I am the CEO of Infraco Asia, a regional infrastructure developer and investor. And I'll be pleased to be your moderator today. I'm absolutely delighted that we have a distinguished panel of experts, and I will first let each panelist introduce her and or himself, including the organization which they represent. I would like to turn to Nikki first, followed by Paul, and then Pinoy. Nikki.
Thank you very much, Allard and Tim. Thank you very much for having me today. I am thrilled to be here and really interested in this conversation because it's at the heart of one of the really important work topics that I'm working on for the World Economic Forum. I lead the Sustainable Development Investment Partnership for the World Economic Forum here in Asia. And it is a joint initiative actually between the World Economic Forum and the OECD. And the focus is around how to create the conditions or support the creation of the conditions for capital to flow to sustainable development in the region. So it's very broad and much broader, of course, than energy, but energy is such a critical part of the development for the region. And also, of course, a very critical part of our climate future, that the topic of how to finance a just energy transition is central to the work that I'm doing here in Asia. Thanks, Alad.
Paul.
Hi, thank you, and good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, depending on where you are. Yeah, delighted to be here. My name is Paul Jordan. I'm the business leader for Innovative Support and International at the Energy Systems Catapult. The Catapult network is a range of not-for-profit private sector businesses that are really thinking about some of the systemic challenges to future changes in energy. We've got others in high-value manufacturing and digital and offshore renewables, etc. But really what we're about is trying to help the UK develop innovation and capture the business opportunities from that growth. But with respect to the energy system, of course, you have to really understand what that future energy system is going to look like. And we've been really pioneering the need to take a very much a whole system approach to addressing that future energy system in order for it to be appropriate for net zero. So this means thinking about some of the challenges, not just around technology, but also around the market structures, around the business models, and really how you engage with the consumers. So I'm very happy to share some of those thinking from our side.
Thank you, Paul. Last but definitely not least, Pinoy.
Thanks a lot, and good morning and good afternoon to everyone wherever you are. My name is Pinoy, and I'm a senior consultant at Carbon Trust Singapore office, and I look after the corporate sustainability in Singapore as well as the Southeast Asia region. And we at Carbon Trust are an expert advisor to the government, to the corporates, as well as to the region, as well as in the regions for their journey towards net zero. So recently we have seen a lot of commitments towards net zero, and every one of us actually needs to work together and actually reach the net zero targets. But a lot of us will need a lot of advisories, and that's exactly where we come in, and we provide advisories to the government, to the regions and the corporates. So you're looking forward to our discussions now here.
And thank you very much, Prannoy. A couple of introductory remarks before I turn to the panel with a number of questions. The clean energy space race is definitely advancing in Southeast Asia. Countries do compete for global leadership. The policies and approaches governments take will have profound implications for the energy industry. We will cover green hydrogen. Is this fantasy or is it indeed the fuel for the future? Low carbon hydrogen has currently a tiny share of the global energy markets. However, governments and investors are placing big bets on it and on the long-term potential. Walking up the realities of carbon pricing, risks and opportunities ahead. The carbon price is considered by many to be the cornerstone of any successful energy transition, but the carbon price has been soaring ahead to a level well beyond projections. Carbon capture and storage and negative emissions to the path to commercialization and scale. Negative emissions technologies to include carbon capture and storage will have and nature-based solution are increasingly seen as having an important role to play in reaching ambitious to net zero targets. And then last but not least, energy storage. Is this unlocking the power of renewables? The development of affordable, high density and long duration energy storage is considered to be essential to be meeting the challenges of intermittency that has prevented renewables reaching their full potential. Let me turn to the questions, and the first question are going to be addressed by both Nikki as well as Pinoy. What will need to happen, in your view, to support the development to retire and replace coal-fired power capacity? Nikki, you first, followed by Pranay.
How long did you say I've got? Thanks, Alad. It's a big question, and I joke, but I really mean it. There is such a huge collective effort needed in order for that transition to occur. One of the, I can't recall if it was Tom or Simon, spoke about how deeply embedded coal has been in the energy infrastructure and the whole economy here in Asia, but across emerging markets. And really, if we look at the last 10 years, the amount of investment that has actually gone into low and middle income countries, this is over the past 10 years, for energy transition, it's only 5% of the total global. Now, of course, that's shifting, but 5% is a very small number. So even if you double it, it's still only a very small number. So what is incredibly clear is the transition is occurring very, very fast in developed countries, and we need to now focus on developing markets, developing and emerging markets. So what I think that takes is a pathway. You know, what does that pathway look like? What are the essential steps that are going to guide? This is something we've been working on, is the essential steps to guide industry, both the finance industry, the energy industry, and of course, civil society around the just elements to ensure that the certainty and stability, I'm quoting Simon here, certainty and stability that's needed in order for finance to flow. So, so when we talk about this sort of guiding principles, they cover all aspects of the economy, and really important to think about it in country terms. But I take your point earlier that you've made around the interconnectivity and the fact that there are a lot of cross-border initiatives going on as well. But specifically, countries make their energy policies. So incentives that are directed clearly at reducing coal investment, potentially even divestment, as well as positive incentives towards renewables. And the second is around price certainty. So I think until you get that level of certainty around price certainty around assets and the cash flows that are attached to that particular energy project, it's very, very difficult for a private sector to come in. One of the things to underpin that, of course, is to bring supporting finance from the developed countries in order to help underpin and de-risk. And this is one of the things that we also think is very, very important. If the world is going to move ahead, then really there's going to need some support from the developed countries to developing. We've put a notional number on that of $10 billion a year for the next 10 years. That has some science, but it should at least move. If private capital comes in at about 3 times that, then it should move about 50% of the coal capacity in emerging markets.
Thanks, Nikki. Pranay, your views.
Simon, this is a very interesting and very relevant question. I mean, when we talk about energy transition, I think most of the time focuses on renewable energy, how we can actually grow the renewable energy capacity. But a very important aspect of energy transition, or when we are talking about accelerating the energy transition, is looking at the assets that we have. And if you look particularly in Southeast Asia, most of the plants are actually fired by coal actually. So we have to look into how we can actually transition, phase out, and actually retire those kind of coal-fired power plants. So, I mean, if you look at each of the country, they have different kind of power plant, different kind of portfolio of coal-fired power plants. They have different ambitions for the NDCs. They have different ambitions for the energy transition. So what I would like to share here is one of the the projects that we are doing together with the ADB, Asian Development Bank, which we have actually completed our pre-feasibility study, particularly for the 3 countries, which is in Vietnam, Philippines, and Indonesia. And now the next step actually is to roll out a pilot, and we call it actually an innovative financing mechanism. And the term we have given it is called energy transition mechanism. So energy transition mechanism is basically nothing much, but it is a special purpose vehicle, which is invested by the multilateral bank, by concessionary finance. And in that special purpose vehicle, or ETM, we have two funds. One is the coal retirement fund, another one is the green fund. So basically this ETM is administered by the national level government. And as I mentioned, for each specific country, based on their portfolio of coal-fired power plant, based on their NDC's commitment and their views on energy transition, we have a very specific ETMs. So what happens in ETM is, usually the coal-fired power plants are usually state-owned. They will contribute their asset into the coal retirement fund of that SPV. And in return, they will get an equity in that SPV, as well as some cash proceeds. And we are expecting that cash proceeds will be used by those facility owners into developing, like new grid capacity, new renewable capacities. I just want to touch on the green fund part of the energy transition mechanism as well. And those funds will be used actually to scale up, like the technology transfer, capability building, to enhance the adoption of the green technologies at a larger scale. So that's how, you mentioned two words, right, which was replacement and retirement, and these two has to go hand in hand. And this is the energy transition mechanism we have kind of rolling out, or we're testing out with countries, and hopefully we can scale it up to other countries as well.
Thank you very much. Those were very good insights. Paul, let me turn to you. Renewable energy generations, and in particular wind and solar, comes with intermittency. Is there a role to combine this with baseload renewable energy, such as waste to energy and hydro?
Certainly there'll be opportunities there, but I think it's worth thinking about some of the work we've been looking at in the UK, where we're actually looking more at the demand side, which I think is an interesting way to manage the energy system. So what I mean by that is when you look at the move towards electrification in a lot of countries, particularly when you think about electric vehicles, there's going to be a much higher need for electricity consumption. On one hand, that means, yes, you potentially need more energy, but actually when you look at the profile of when that energy is used, then you can start to think about a much more smart, clever energy system where you can try to match load and demand against supply. Now, of course, what you need in the mix there is also things like energy storage in order to balance out those peaks and troughs, but some of that can also come from some of that demand side technology as well. There's some technologies we call vehicle to grid, for example, that when you have electric vehicles, that's essentially a mobile energy storage facility. So if you can start to bring forward digital solutions, digital technologies, to look at how people are using those vehicles, where they are, what capacity is needed, etc., then that's just one example of where you can start to aggregate that that sort of mobile facility that you've got from a storage perspective, and start to use that to balance the potential intermittency that might come from renewables. So I think managing load, but also utilizing technologies and bringing forward some of the digital solutions to link demand side better with supply side can also be a really clever way to deal with those intermittency challenges. You're on mute there, Alad.
The most sad question in the last 18 months, I think. Sorry about that. Back to Prannoy and then Nikki. How are energy companies preparing for the specter of rising carbon prices, and where are they seeing the opportunities in carbon, in trading, CO2 highways, carbon recycling and utilization? Prannoy, first to you and then followed by Nikki, please.
Sure. So, as you just mentioned, the rising energy price or the carbon prices actually brings both opportunities as well as the risk. So in terms of risk mitigation, I've seen like in the region, not just the energy companies, but a lot of them are using a tool called internal carbon pricing. And they're actually integrating that internal carbon pricing into the investment decision making. Like, for example, whatever they are planning to invest in for the long term, maybe 20, 25 years, what is the impact of the carbon price to that investment? So yeah, that is very critical. Apart from that, the internal carbon pricing tool is also used for their existing kind of portfolios of investments. Like, what is the risk that that portfolio is exposed to if the carbon prices increase in future? So I believe this tool has to be used by much more companies so that they can actually identify and mitigate, like, what are the risks they are exposed to. The second thing you talked about was the opportunities. But definitely, I mean, with the rising carbon price, there will be a lot of opportunities in terms of technologies which will be coming up. So the companies, specifically energy companies, they need to adopt to new technologies, more like renewable technologies. And together with that, as Paul was mentioning, I mean, there'll be different sources of energy and there'll be more intermittency. And so there'll be more smarter kind of technology and smarter grid management, and all the resources of energy need to be managed very well as well. So with that, the new business models, like, for example, energy as a service will come up as well. And that's what I think the energy and the utilities companies should kind of embark on.
Thanks, Pranay. Nikki.
Look, the only thing that I would add to that, because I absolutely agree with Pranay, I think this pricing, this internal pricing mechanism, and bringing it into, evaluating it into financing decisions, not just in energy actually, but in the nature-based solution space as well, is going to be quite critical in changing the values and bringing the incentives, almost market incentives, into driving towards renewables. One of the key things that I think really needs to happen in order for there to be efficiency and effectiveness across carbon decisions in the market generally is the ratification of Article 6 next week. And so should that occur, which we all hope it will, there we can then start looking at where the carbon value sits, and how countries can perhaps start using that as a mechanism to create value in their transition. And this starts to sort of where the convergence between creating incentives and the market starts to become quite powerful. So that's really all I'd like to add there.
Thank you very much. Let me turn to hydrogen and to you, Paul. What is, in your view, the role of green hydrogen in the future energy, and in relation to that, is hydrogen an efficient use of renewables that will be in short supply as the transition progresses?
Yeah, a really great question. So I think the first thing to say is, from our analysis, looking at the UK, just using the UK as an example, we do see three key vectors playing into the pathways for net zero. If you look at our Innovation for Net Zero work out to 2050, the pathways analysis that we've done there shows that there will be more electrification, but there also will be a need for more hydrogen, and also more need, certainly in the UK's case, more work on district heat networks. Now, if you're looking at other hotter countries, that might be more around district cooling networks, but it's still a similar sort of trend, I think. So the first point to make is that there's a need for all of these solutions in the future energy mix to get to 2050. It's not an either or. But looking at green hydrogen specifically, I think it's worth thinking about the pros and cons of hydrogen, and when compared to things like battery technology. So one of the challenges with hydrogen, of course, it is a lot more inefficient to turn wind or solar into, let's say movement in a vehicle, because you've got many more steps on that journey, and in terms of conversion, and there's losses and so on and so forth. So in some respects, you'd say, well, why would you do that? But then you look at some of the advantages of hydrogen, in that it is more energy dense. You can compress it. You can have hydrogen in larger quantities with lower weight. And so when you start to look at applications like, for instance, long haul heavy duty vehicles and long haul transport, maybe looking at trains, ships, planes, these sorts of things, it's very hard to see how potentially batteries would necessarily be able to compete with hydrogen in some of those applications, as well as long duration storage. You know, there are some strong advantages in hydrogen when you start to look at long duration energy storage, which again, going back to the renewables intermittency point, you know, again, could be an opportunity there. So, and then I think the last thing to think about with hydrogen as well is you know, you don't have to necessarily transport just hydrogen. You can convert it into things like, you know, ammonia, which again can be a more energy dense medium for transport of hydrogen. So there's lots of pros and cons, I think, of different solutions. But from our perspective, I think there will definitely be a role for hydrogen. Sorry, one note was I knew there was one note I was missing. It was industrial decarbonisation as well. So that's the other key, you know, key role for hydrogen that we see is in industrial decarbonisation. Many industrial processes as well. You know, again, you can start to see that actually hydrogen is one of those solutions that can come forward there as well.
Thanks, Paul. We've got literally 2 minutes left. Look, energy transition will obviously be tied to financing. So let me turn to Nikki. This whole energy transition process will rely on availability of finance, and in particularly to ensure that retirement of coal-fired generation is replaced by new baseload and cross-border low-emission generation. What's your view on how best to achieve this? Do you see a role for both public and private sector to finance this?
I'm going to be super quick, and I'm going to say yes and. So public and private sector most definitely. So I mentioned earlier this magic number of $10 billion. It's not magic. It's kind of back of the envelope calculation of if you 10 billion of public money can attract approximately 3 times as much, or catalyze approximately 3 times as much private money. So you end up with $40 billion a year. Then over 10 years, that's $400 billion. And that is enough to retire 50% of, approximately 50% of emerging markets' coal capacity as it stands today. So if they keep developing it, then we blow it out. But, you know, as it stands today. Now, the really important part of this is what are the guiding principles, if you like, that are going to create the certainty or the confidence around driving towards that sort of investment and creating the right enabling environments and so on. And just a quick plug, we are about to launch next week some guiding principles called the Principles for Financing a Just and Urgent Energy Transition. It will be a call to signatures for the private sector to sign up, but also importantly, the whole ecosystem, energy companies and civil society. It needs to be just. We cannot leave others behind on the journey. It's my final plug.
Thank you very much, Nikki, and I'm pleased to confirm that the organization which I represent is actually a signature to that statement. Great panel. Thank you very much for your contribution, Nikki, Paul, and Pinoy. I'm now pleased to hand over to Thomas Briot, who is also a member of the BRITCHAM Singapore Energy and Utilities Committee, to moderate the next session.
Thank you, Allard, and thank you to everyone. Good afternoon, good morning to those in Europe. Thank you for joining us. As Allard said, my name is Thomas Briot. I'm the energy leader for Arup in Southeast Asia. Arup's an engineering and design consultancy working in the energy business across APAC. And thank you in particular to those interesting discussions from Allard's panel, and particularly that great segue from Paul into hydrogen. You know, we heard from Tom Moody earlier about the big ambitions for COP26, and this session will discuss how hydrogen and carbon capture and storage can be part of that global transition, and specifically for ASEAN countries. I will shortly ask each of our panelists to introduce themselves and give a 3 to 5 minute description of an interesting project they've been making a reality. And after that, we'll have a quick fire panel session discussing key characteristics to get right in order to make the decarbonisation projects mainstream rather than, trials and test beds and R&D. So it was over a year ago now when I chaired a panel session on hydrogen for the Energy and Utilities Committee for BRITCHAM. And looking back, we heard from a variety of different speakers, including Her Excellency Cara Owen, who kind of looked forward to COP, and also from John Saltmarsh, who's heading up research at the UK Department for Energy and Industrial Strategy, as well as NTU, BP and the Scottish Hydrogen Association. And one of the key points was around hydrogen, how hydrogen could be made a reality and the need for revenue certainty through a secure supply chain, but perhaps some sort of revenue support. And a year on, we've moved forward. We've got over 75 countries announcing net zero ambitions, perhaps more in the coming weeks up around COP, and 30 countries have hydrogen-specific strategies, with the first hydrogen law being passed in South Korea recently. But are we any closer to achieving revenue certainty? So without further ado, I'll hand over to Henry C, from who is Director for New Mobilities Technology at the Connected Places Catapult. I'd be interested to hear from you on how the UK is accelerating the transition towards zero carbon solutions using hydrogen in various different mobility modes. Henry.
Hi, thank you. Nice talking to you again. One thing that we hear early on is about the generation of hydrogen and the hydrogen infrastructure. However, that Connected Places Catapult, we are more thinking about of the ecosystem itself, from the supply and demand and how it regulates. Some of the project that we've been doing in the last year is now starting going towards that and looking the whole business model. I mean, one of the things that we need to realize, transport sector responsible for about a quarter of the global CO2 emissions. And so within my team, we've been focusing on few areas. That last couple of years, we've been looking at in the road transport about investigating the options for decarbonising transport, and in particular in the long-haul heavy goods vehicles. What we identify as the promising options are being developed, including the hydrogen fuel cells and the electric road systems. What go further this year, we actually start working with the government bodies, the regulators, the energy supplier, and also the logistic goods company and the service provider, in actually starting to do the in-depth planning and design for the future large-scale freight deployment happening in the next this few years timeline. Then on the other side, we also have been in the aviation sectors. We've been hearing from Airbus earlier this year, talking about the development and deployment of the world's first zero emissions commercial aircraft, which could enter in service by 2035. More importantly, thinking about that is how we are in the UK is now working in looking at how the airport infrastructure can support that. So this year and in the next few years, this year we're already looking at the whole transformation of the operating model of the airport infrastructure in order to handle hydrogens and electricity for the heavy demand coming through from the commercial aircraft. That for the large, medium, and small airports, in order to make this a success and allow the aircraft to land and operating in a sustainable way. And lastly, in the maritime, just to give a bit more flavor, that we are doing quite a lot into development, join forces with all the industry, the port, and the vessel operator in looking at zero emission vessel technology and how the greener ports in a real world context, to making sure that we are not just looking at research and technology and innovations, but actually looking at the business model, how it impacts into this sector.
Thanks, Henry. Very interesting work the Catapult seems to be involved in there. I'll now hand over to Michael Jenner, Corporate Affairs Director at Sembcorp Energy UK. Michael, just wondered if you could tell us about the Whitetail Clean Energy project that Sembcorp are developing in Teesside as part of the East Coast cluster in the UK. You're on mute, Michael.
Okay, thanks, Thomas. Yeah, so Whitetail Clean Energy, we're developing that on Teesside, as you said, Thomas. It's a first of a kind technology using the Allen-Fedved cycle, where natural gas is combined with pure oxygen to run the cycle, and it produces pipeline quality CO2 that's ready to go into a transport and storage network. So we're delighted that the East Coast cluster has been selected by UK government as one of the first two CCUS projects. So we're hoping that we'll play a key role in that. We're developing Whitetail Clean Energy on the Wilton International site. So anybody who's familiar with Singapore will know about the Jurong Island site and the industrial cluster there. Wilton International is kind of a mini Jurong Island. So we have our own private wires network where we supply power and heat to our customers. So we've already got a great industrial cluster there, hoping to grow that and provide the clean power via Whitetail. In addition to that, we've got a number of hydrogen projects which are developing up at Teesside, one of which is BP's H2 hydrogen project. That's a plan for 1 gigawatt worth of blue hydrogen. And if that goes ahead, that's 2 million tons of CO2 being captured to feed into the East Coast cluster TNS system. So we're very hopeful that Teesside will really be a leader and a world leader in a CCUS cluster that really works, coupled with hydrogen. And we're open to share that with colleagues globally. We talk a lot with our colleagues in Singapore and share ideas, and industry really needs to talk to each other about how these things are working.
Yeah, very interesting. I think CO2 could be one of those globally traded things, along with potentially hydrogen. So it's interesting to see how we transport that to places where it can be long-term sequestered. So I'll now hand over to Gareth Williams, Strategy Director for the National Composite Centre, High Value Manufacturing Catapult. Gareth.
Thanks, Thomas. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can.
Excellent. Just checking. Yeah, hi, everyone. Yes, so I work for the National Composite Centre. We're part of the High Value Manufacturing Catapult. So we're one of 7 centres working on everything from design and manufacturing technology. And we have about £1 billion worth of capital assets to really support industry with creating new platforms and products to deliver net zero. But one thing that we've recognised is that to deliver net zero in a cost-efficient way, we need to do things differently. There needs to be better connection across sectors. There needs to be more public-private partnerships to accelerate activity. And so we created, with other Catapult partners and some of our technology centre partners within the UK, a concept called the Hydrogen Innovation Initiative, which is really focused on in particular, focusing on a strategic way of accelerating cross-cutting technologies. So those technologies that will actually be deployed across multiple sectors, so that we can have a coordinated strategic value proposition that can develop technologies in the UK and make sure that we have that in train with the support infrastructure required for hydrogen in particular, so that we really connect the generation markets to the distribution markets, how you get the hydrogen where you need it, and in particular where the consumption markets, technologies that need to be in place to actually consume the hydrogen that we're all planning to produce in a cost-efficient way. So I guess one specific example of that, something that's very dear to us at the National Composite Centre is composite pressure vessels. So everyone will probably recognise in composite pressure vessels or storage of hydrogen is going to have a role in the generation markets, in how you distribute it and store it and how you consume it. So we're focusing on our vision of driving affordability and performance criteria for composite pressure vessels that will see themselves in hydrogen vehicles, HGVs, in cryogenic storage, in aircraft. They're really helping to drive forwards the adoption of hydrogen-related propulsion technology that are going to be a critical cog in the future hydrogen economy. So we've created this model to make sure that we are better connected and that we help develop supply chains to support these solutions and interface really well with the clustering activity that's happening in the UK as well to make sure we have takeoff of those as well.
Very interesting. Yeah, thank you, and thank you all for your introductions. Some very interesting projects and activities that you're all engaged in. We are pressed for time, so I'm going to ask you some quick fire questions. Hopefully, you can make your answer last not much longer than a minute. So Henry, back to you. Are you starting to see a secure revenue stream that's really incentivizing significant investment in hydrogen mobility rather than just pilot projects?
Yes, I mean, interesting. Just pilot trials. I mean, in the 3 different areas that I was talking about, on the airport project, for example, notice that there is actually a lot of technology already available. A lot of SME and innovators already have put their own funding into it to deliver capability. We got commitment from the government, who is setting out the policy. Most of
we seem to be having a few connectivity issues there, unfortunately, with Henry. So I might quickly just run to a question for you, Michael.
The use of new energy. It's more importantly for transport hub and places to understand the requirement, the demand, and the costs and the benefit of using this new energy and prepare the infrastructure itself. So all of these elements, I think, is we've got pocket of things are being invested, but what we need to do now going forward is actually how to connect the sectors and industry together to create a whole ecosystem, to give a little bit more spark on the further investment is actually making sure that it become a reliable, sustainable ecosystems.
Thanks for that, Henry. We missed you a little bit in the middle there, but yeah, I agree about the interconnectivity and something that Gareth also talked about there. So, Michael, I just wondered if I could ask you a little bit about what's really going to fund hydrogen use. At the moment it is more expensive, but we're beginning to value the carbon reduction it provides, just like we value waste collection in the terms of municipal solid waste. It's only viable because we value the collection of that waste, and it's time it moves on to CO2. But the question is, who's going to pay for that? Is it going to be bill payers? Is it going to be consumers of the products that are produced, or is it going to be general taxation? And how quickly do you think zero carbon can really be achieved within those countries that have pledged it zero carbon? And more specifically, I suppose, on Teesside.
Yeah, no problem. I'll answer all that in 1 minute. Yeah, so on Teesside, we feel we're seeing the right mix of government support for low carbon projects coupled with wider economic regeneration policies. So, for example, a lot of our earlier speakers have talked about what's happening in the UK, and we've got these specific projects on Teesside, but Wilton International, our site, for example, Semcorp site, is part of one of the first free ports that's been relaunched here in the UK. So in addition to huge amount of government support and interest, we've also got the incentive for industry to get involved and to build on the site. Now, we're ready to do that at Semcorp. We're putting in place the Whitetail Clean Energy Project and what we call a plug-and-play setup, where we're inviting industry to come on our site, build on our site, and we're ready to supply them with power as they need it. So we've already got concentrated demand on Teesside, but we want to grow that demand. And we think we're seeing the right balance between the government and the industry coming together and sharing the risk and sharing the costs. And there's a lot of detail behind that, which we can't go into now. But for me, if we can just demonstrate anywhere, for example, on Teesside, that it works and that the right partnership's there, we can then share that. And as I mentioned earlier, we're already doing that a lot with our colleagues in Singapore to share our learnings here in the UK, how industry is working together with government, and hopefully that model can be replicated globally.
Excellent, thank you. And that was a pretty good effort at answering all of that in 1 minute. So thank you for that. Just moving over to Gareth, if I could ask you a similar sort of question as it relates to wider UK energy market. What do you think are the critical areas that effective public-private partnerships must really be formed to succeed in delivering net zero?
Yeah, it's a good question, Thomas. And I think it was raised in an earlier panel that the role that government plays, particularly pushing a new energy transition into developed economies, is going to be really important. Striking that balance of public investment to incentivize the right investments from private enterprises is going to be really important, and in particular to drive, from our perspective, in particular those technology developments and the opportunity that brings for the local economy. So obviously with early stage research where you've got technology development, multiple technologies feed products, you've got multiple products then feed system level innovation. And we think, Michael can probably testify that the model that the UK is pushing for the industrial clustering is really good. It's stimulating good collaboration at the systems level with multiple companies coming together and playing a strong role in reaching the 5 gigawatts. Downstream of that, we also need the distribution and consumption markets suitably incentivized for companies to invest in new technology platforms that will be critical to unlocking the full value of the hydrogen economy. And in that, directive policy is needed with the funding to support that, specific interventions in different sectors to make sure that we build, at least in the UK, and the model in the UK is going to be different to Singapore and how that plays out. But developing those supply chains that really support those technology platforms that are going to be required for consumption markets in the hydrogen economy. And really importantly, if we're starting from scratch in hydrogen, so reasonably from scratch in the consumption markets in particular. So there's a lot of investment that's going to be needed globally to reach those targets and deliver those new platforms. In parallel to that, to accelerate them, we need this right standard certification frameworks in place, and that's going to be critical. Otherwise, they become a barrier to entry. So you can accelerate those technologies and effectively hit a certification brick wall, which prevents those technologies coming on stream. So the role that government play in helping to drive the right behaviours to incentivize that collaboration in the standard certification part of innovation, I think is also going to be really important. So that's probably my 1 minute summary.
Yeah, no, and I think you're very right there. We've seen papers on how green is blue hydrogen. I've seen academic papers that are suggesting it's worse than burning coal, and of course they took the worst case of the worst case, which was assuming, the fugitive emissions of fracked North American gas combined with very old SMR technology. But interesting, we do have SMR and old SMR technology here in Singapore producing hydrogen, which is used in the town's gas network, which is 50% hydrogen here. So it feels to me like we've got a bit of a head start. And I kind of wanted to ask Henry, do you think there's a place for hydrogen fuel cell vehicles in Singapore specifically, and then perhaps more broadly across the ASEAN region?
Yeah, I mean, that definitely. I mean, it's just the beginning of the journey of the hydrogen fuel cell vehicles. That for more complex platform is the way to go. I mean, I talk about heavy good vehicles and aircraft that require to do a longer journey and then more heavyweight. Hydrogen fuel cell is the way to go, I think. One of the things that I think is very useful for Singapore and the wider regions is that as the Connected Places Catapult, we have set out a number of use cases and case study in the last few years. How does it apply for heavy goods vehicles? How does it get the airport infrastructure ready? That we have launched some of these white paper on our website, and how is applied. We're looking at in all the different places around UK at the moment, as well as the use cases for port at the moment. I think what is important for Singapore and the wide region is we need to look into the particular characteristics, and also, as Gary said, mentioned about the government policy settings, and lastly is also the company, the operator around the regions that who would like to trialing out and adopting it. That can, based on the practice that we have set out in the UK, I can see there is a big collaborations, activities that we can do, that if we can set out early with Singapore and the wider regions of the requirements, it will influence all the vehicle manufacturers, the technology providers, and will help to support the transition of the infrastructure to get ready for the adoption of the hydrogen fuel cell vehicles. So I think it's just at the right time if we get the investor and the company in the regions to start thinking about it and start picking up some of the work that we have been through so far to date.
Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, and I guess, you know, many would see that the electric vehicle is kind of one in Singapore. It's flat, it's small, it's easy, but as you say, shipping and aviation are big opportunities, and Singapore has a lot of both of those. Perhaps less of the aviation at the moment, but it will come back, I'm sure, and so some opportunities there.
You just muted yourself, Thomas.
Oh, sorry. Just coming back to Michael then, just wondered if you think their successful projects do you think there are successful projects still needed to demonstrate replicability worldwide, or do you think we already have those and it's just a case of creating the regulatory framework?
You know, my sense is we definitely need to demonstrate that this can happen on a commercial scale. And like I say, you know, we'd be delighted if it's Teesside, but if it's anywhere, we all benefit. Wherever that happens first, then we communicate. A few years ago in the UK, there was clear government support for CCUS. Industry were working on it. There was a change in government policy, and that support was withdrawn. That can never happen again. I mean, if we're going to take advantage of the opportunity we've got now, there can't be those changes. And a lot of other speakers have mentioned it as well. Industry need that certainty. We're working on the basis it won't change this time around. And I really do think, you know, there's a number of places in the world globally where we could get this done first. And once it's demonstrated that it is economically viable, perhaps with things like a free port, like we've got in Teesside with tax breaks or however it works, then we can share that. And I think that the future is bright for the opportunities there.
Yeah. Thanks, Michael. Okay, well, and finally, Gareth, if you had one request of policymakers, other than to not change their mind about support in general for hydrogen and for CCUS, what would that one request to governments in the UK, but also around the world be?
Yeah, I might be cheeky and make that 1.5, just feeding back off what Michael said, because I think one important thing that government and policymakers need to get used to is there's a whole scale of complexity, you know, that really we have to get familiar with. You know, system level complexity of driving to net zero. It's non-binary. There isn't going to be the right solution for each application. You aren't going to see it's going to be electric vehicles or hydrogen vehicles. it will be, you know, the right application for the, or the right solution for the right application. And there might be other drivers that actually decide that. So that's going to be interesting how that plays out, but policymakers need to be comfortable with that and thinking at the system level. But I think the most important thing really is, as we face the, you know, the challenge of net zero, is that the policymakers, governments around the world really need to inspire, you know, the global population to drive to net zero. The general public don't know, you know, half of the stuff we know, being so close to hydrogen, and there's a big behavioral change that needs to happen to support it. So what I would say is that governments really need to focus on an aspirational level of ambition to inspire you know, businesses to invest in new and exciting technologies that will be required, and they do need to provide the level of support, certainty, and then funding to secure that as well.
Thank you, Gareth, and thank you to Henry, to Michael as well. Very interesting points of view, and really great to hear about some of the work that's happening back in the UK. So I'll now hand over to Ben Arnott to talk a little bit about finance and risk. Over to you, Ben.
Thank you very much, Thomas, and thank you to everybody for staying with us for this Finance and Risk Roundtable. My name is Ben Arnott, and I lead Societe Generale's Energy Finance team in Southeast Asia, based here in Singapore, and I'll be your host for this session. To achieve the things we've discussed in the previous sessions, we're going to need a fundamental transformation to the global investment and finance landscape. And the good news is that it's already well underway. Success in mobilizing both private and public capital to finance energy transition will only be achieved by implementing a complementary and coordinated set of actions taken by the public sector, the private sector, and within civil society. And it needs to happen at an accelerated pace and a larger scale than ever before. And it needs to happen in the early part of this decade in order to accommodate the lead times that are required for financing major energy projects. Overall, the finance and investor community needs to deliver up to $5 trillion of investment per year between now and 2050. That's an estimate made in the GMFA Climate Finance Report. Only that level of investment will allow the ambitions set out in the Paris Agreement to be achieved. And the question really is the finance and investment community up for that challenge? In terms of the new risks being faced between now and 2050, these are still being understood and quantified. However, it is clear that climate-related risks will create winners and losers in the economy. It will affect investors and financial institutions directly if their clients are unable to repay loans, pay dividends, are left with stranded assets, or achieve only lowly valuations or impacted credit ratings. But there's also an equally compelling opportunity for investors and financial institutions to be at the center of energy transition and to reinvent their relationships with their clients. And perhaps this is the reason why the changes that are at hand are being embraced so wholeheartedly by the finance community. We've got a fantastic panel to discuss the progress we've seen to date and to discuss the challenges that lie ahead in the future. Let me introduce them for you. Firstly, we've got Nick Dingemans. He's a partner at Pennington, Manches and Cooper. And Nick's going to focus on the investor's viewpoint. We've got Dr. Kaho Yu. He's the lead energy analyst for APAC for Veresk Maplecroft, and he focuses on energy policy and ESG risk, particularly in the Asia region. We've got Dominic Gregory. He's a partner at Bryan Cave, Leighton and Paisner. And as well as his deep transactional experience, he's a regular commentator on energy transition topics in public policy. Last but not least, we've got Alison Young. She's global expert and investment specialist focusing on innovation within the UK's Connected Places Catapult. And we're going to leap right into the Q&A and roundtable session with an opening question to all of the panelists. I'd like you to describe your interactions with the investment and finance community and how they've evolved in the last 2 years. What opportunities have you been able to take advantage of? And where have you witnessed the greatest changes in the way you conduct your business with regards to investment and financing? Dominic, let's start with you. Never short of an opinion. how's things working out for you in the last couple of years?
Thank you, Ben. It sounds a bit trite, but as an advisor, as a legal advisor in Southeast Asia, I guess it splits into two ways for somebody like me. Firstly, there's a push out of the green and sustainable loan products in all their glory. I think most of the audience will probably be aware of those, the ability to have a green loan or perhaps a sustainability linked loan or a social loan, something for a social purpose. And then there's the sort of the downstream, the ends. If those are the means, then the ends, which would be all manner of renewables projects in emerging markets as well as the more developed ones. And there's a number of things that have crept in the last couple of years. We've been putting these in place for a long time, but co-location of those with the entities that actually require the power, corporate PPAs, electrical storage, dealing with intermittency. So all of these are fairly trite. So I'll keep my first response relatively short, but we've seen a lot of activity there and some struggles that we can come on to in some of the markets, putting those deals in place.
Thank you very much. In true spirit of fairness, I ought to let the other legal partner comment immediately. Nick.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. I'm on the corporate M&A side, whereas I think Dominic's coming from the finance perspective more. I'm seeing more and more startups in the sustainability space, working with interesting products aimed at, from the start, at trying to create sustainability, reduce carbon, those sorts of things. I'm also seeing, when I'm in my advisory role to boards really wanting to understand what's happening, wanting to understand how they're going to transition, how they're going to deliver net zero, not by 2050. A lot of the boards we're talking to are talking about 2040 and before, because they know they need to be in the 2040s absolutely delivering and already being there, because going to what some of the earlier panelists said, we don't know when the goalposts are going to get moved, so we need to be ready. So yeah, that's what we're seeing.
Thank you. Kahu, coming to you, how's your interactions with the finance and investment community? Is it still head in the sand, or are people engaged?
Yeah, as a risk consultancy, we observe that the increasing shareholder pressure and government regulations are changing the risk landscape. There are more and more ESG criteria that are imposed on the investor and banks and so on. And that's why they have shifted away from the fossil fuel projects to low carbon intensity ones. And eventually there's a kind of a chain effect, which makes a lot of the energy companies to even to drop off their own fossil fuel projects. And we expect this kind of risk will remain in the market, and there will be increasing demand for the investors to kind of reassess their strategy with more ESG integration.
Thank you, Karim. Alison, turning to you. I mean, you're at the bleeding edge on a lot of these sort of energy transition topics and innovation topics. I mean, how's your interactions been? Are you getting a good reception from the finance and investor community?
Yeah, absolutely. And agreeing with Nick, we're seeing a lot more SMEs coming into the marketplace with kind of sustainability and sort of new energy technologies from the offset. And there's a lot more interest in international companies looking at the UK ecosystem as well, and looking for investment and financing. We're also seeing a lot of UK cities really proactively looking at how they will achieve net zero and the sort of investment that they're needing to find and plug the gap, because there really isn't the public sector investment to go into that. So it's looking at how we can help them on that journey from an innovation perspective, but really seeing a lot of conversations about it and a lot of interest from investors.
That's fascinating. I think we can all get bound up in the kind of big corporate world, but it's great to see sort of action at the SME level as well. Kahu, I'm going to start with you for this second question. Some of the previous panels talked about regulation, keeping the goalposts, understanding where the goalposts are, keeping the landscapes, fairly constant. But I just wanted to explore what do you think is the best way to drive the sort of shifts that are required in the finance sector? Is it a stick? Is it a rule of law? Is it regulation? Is it shareholder pressure, stakeholder pressure? or is it, you know, this kind of altruistic feeling that we're all in this together and we've got to make this happen?
I would say the most obvious answer is the stakeholder pressure, because they are responsible to make the money, to make the company doing good. And if they care about a lot of, let's say, climate elements, then they are going to make a change to the company. But where does this all come from? I would say in the last few years, we see there's a growing peer pressure for them to make some changes, which means that a lot of this energy stuff or ESG integration is not something just a nice to have, it is a must already. Because there is an increasing compliance requirement for them, the government are stepping up. So on one hand, there are a pushing factor from the government that there will be a regulatory risk if they don't comply with all these climate requirements. And on the other hand, they also found out that if they diverse their investment with more ESG elements, their return may be better off. So there's a kind of a two-way motivation for them to shift kind of their business strategy.
And Dominic, turning to you, you know, you're probably a kind of a very inspirational thinker on this topic. You know, what's going to work well in terms of you know, driving the changes of behaviour that are required in the finance community?
Thank you, Ben. There's a phrase which is being repeated a bit at the moment, which is that large-scale projects do not go best without small-scale practical reasoning. And I think it's important the finance world remembers its place a little bit, in that it may be the means to affect something, but in fact we have you know, many billion consumers and appetites around the world who actually sort of pull the strings and direct where big business goes. And that's the same for affecting and implementing infrastructure development, I think, around Asia. We need to sort of think of the ends. That's why, for example, corporate PPAs are kind of interesting to see immediately where the revenue stream can end up. I think another phrase, which is a bit difficult, but I do focus on a lot, is disaggregation, which is the idea that we probably can't solve too many things at once with the same agenda. So the climate change agenda is sometimes how shall I say, because it's controversial, diluted in the way that it's put into effect. A redistribution of resources, for example, may be a very important agenda, but it shouldn't necessarily dilute the debate about how we quickly come to terms with where we are with the climate. And likewise, some of the other environmental problems. We're delighted, I guess, to see a number of other things which are capable of being solved, such as much more focus on biodiversity and use of waste and this kind of thing. Some of these objects are easier to achieve potentially, and therefore it's important not to lose them in the very difficult one of climate change, which of course goes out over time. That was just a bit of a feeling. I do feel as well that there's a school of thought which is that you set a sort of a special goal, and then you sort of have a leader, and then you kind of go for the goal. Sometimes these things, well, two things are. You approach things sometimes by discovery. In other words, it's negotiation and compromise, of course, which is where we need to get to. And that's what we feel putting in place financings on these transactions. It's all about risk appetite, and maybe we can move on to that in another question, maybe about the ability for people to take on more risk and get there by way of compromise to put more in place at the time. Thanks.
Thank you. Alison, turning to you, do you feel like you're getting the right signals from the sort of regulators, from government, which perhaps you're closer to than some of the other panelists? I mean, is it the right framework for the kind of work that you're trying, the things you're trying to achieve?
Yes, I think it is, but there is an element of us working with government to help amend and kind of develop the regulations and the policies. Henry, in his session, mentioned some of the work we're doing around decarbonisation of transport and heavy goods vehicles, looking at the airport infrastructure of the future. How do airports cope with hydrogen planes landing, and what's the infrastructure around that, and also clean ports, green ports, understanding how we can decarbonise the maritime industry. And I think part of the work that we do we're demonstrating and accelerating new technologies, but we're also looking at the regulation and the policy to help the UK government understand, well, what does work, what can we put into place to actually make these technologies work, and I guess also make for investable propositions. You know, we're doing some really interesting work with UK cities because there is a huge funding gap. And so we've launched something called the UK Cities Climate Investment Commission to try and help bring together it's London councils, Core Cities UK, and kind of the Connected Places Catapult convening it, but kind of looking at how we can, I suppose, break down the barriers to investment, because it's not that there isn't finance available, it's the fact that, you know, you can't really create a robust business case and investment model that would address the issue of scale, longevity, and sort of confidence in some of these investment propositions within cities. So I think there's a number of things that we are trying to do, and some of it's being very proactive, putting together these kind of commissions. I'm very much working hand in hand with government to look at the
Alison just dropped out at the end there, but I mean, that's so encouraging, isn't it? Left hand talking to the right hand. And I think one of the emerging or the key themes from this whole event in the last couple of days has been a sort of level of collaboration that's both needed and is occurring. It's great. Nick, anything else to add on that point?
I would just sort of pick up on what everyone's saying is if you're sitting in a boardroom advising someone, what the issue isn't what we know about, it's the unknowns. So we have many jurisdictions legislating for net zero, but what we don't understand is the regulatory framework of how they intend to achieve that. So we have policy and we have strategy papers coming out, but if you're a business, you know you need to achieve net zero, but you don't know when you have to achieve it by and what the financial consequences of not doing that will be. So it's those known unknowns is the real concern. And I think a lot of people are looking at COP26 starting at the end of the week and the next couple of weeks, and you know, do we get some guidance on things like Article 6 ratification in terms of bringing that whole carbon economy and that sort of stuff into play? So that's the big question, I think.
Well, it's a great segue into my next question, really, which is on kind of barefaced risks that we might be facing as a result of the energy transition, as a result of COP26, as a result of how the economy is reinventing itself. And I must turn to our energy and risk consultant, Kahu, first for this one. I mean, for every yin there's a yang. So I mean, what kind of risk do you see in the business environment as a result of the kind of transformations that we're going through right now?
I would say the recent global energy crisis has shown that the energy transition is a very complicated and interconnected process. And this also means that for an investor, the requirement from the government, from your home country might be very different from the destination. And this goes to the broader discussion of, let's say, the East-West difference, especially in the pace of energy transition. And this kind of inconsistency is always going to create a lot of regulatory confusion for the investor. What are they exactly going to follow? Are they entering something like a trap or something like that? So eventually, I would say this creates a lot of demand for the regulator to show more certainty for the business setup. But at the same time, this also means a lot more opportunities here because they are different pace. And this also means that there is a gap in a lot of stuff. Let's say the innovation, let's say the infrastructure, smaller projects, batteries, CCUS, a lot of these kind of things. And that's why, and this is also where the opportunities come from.
Dominic, you mentioned some of the kind of risk aspects before. Is there anything you'd like to comment on this section?
Yeah, thanks. It's just we're being at the sort of you can't say the coalface anymore, but being at the center of some of these deals that have been put in place through really all of the rim around Asia, from Japan, Korea, Taiwan down to Philippines, and then the rest of Southeast Asia. We classically, putting the deals together for lenders or for developers, frankly, we come up with a risk matrix. And I guess some of the mindset of the practitioners, bankers, credit departments, and developers will be, I don't want to say old-fashioned, but perhaps old-fashioned in terms of we used to try to put together large-scale infrastructure projects, and there would be political risk, there'd be other things. But I guess, you know, the market is still relatively young, but we of course don't see so many stranded renewables assets once they're actually. There's a big difference, of course, in the capital markets between something that's taking construction risk or post or after that. But I do get the feeling that there should be perhaps appetite for more risk. I guess you look at what's leading, and when you look at the sort of intergovernmental things going on, and you know, the rush to try to put these things in place, I guess I'm hoping that there are some aspects which would be, well, as a lawyer, I'd say it's difficult, but perhaps you know, overcome as an immateriality for a raw sort of credit decision, and therefore sort of push things through. And that needs to happen, of course, because we do see really difficult regulatory and licensing and authorization permitting landscapes around a number of these jurisdictions. Just quickly on regulation, I mean, I think it's interesting to compare notes across a little bit. If you can sort of divide up a little bit the infrastructure market, but then the financial regulatory position. And I mean, I think we should acknowledge that there's a reason that the regulators that regulate the financial regulators, shall we say, when they get together, there is a soft hand. You know, certainly so far, I mean, there's not the concept of weighted capital for sustainable finance, of course, at the moment. We have a number of things sort of there in the background, of course, disclosure, stress testing, et cetera, but we don't have that. And I think we don't have that for a very good reason in terms of, you know, there is a sort of unintended consequences possibly. And the thing is of course, fairly fragile. So it's kind of fascinating to see the extent to which there's more teeth to that slowly growing for financial institutions.
Thank you. Alison, turning to you, and you know, if we think about sort of appetite for risk, and I mean, some of the things that you're involved in, I mean, they really are, you know, they really are extremely frontier, should we say? So, I mean, do you sort of appreciate the kind of risk levels that you're working with?
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose we're lucky because from a mobility perspective, we're sort of the innovation arm for the Department for Transport. So we're really lucky to be at the cutting edge of a lot of these technologies and sort of demonstrators in terms of what we're looking at and testing. I think there is a risk that it will be difficult for some of these cities to attract investment and financing for some of their larger projects. But equally, in the budget yesterday, I think 1.7 billion was earmarked for the Levelling Up agenda, which is actually really positive in terms of investing into sort of cities across the UK. So that could be something that helps shore things up. I think Dominic had actually made a point earlier, I think on email, but kind of having a sort of careful, balanced approach. I suppose we want things to move quickly, but equally we don't want to make the wrong decisions and kind of create more environmental impact with what we sort of, you know, what we're trying to implement, being more sustainable. So I think it's just having a balanced approach, but trying to be as innovative as we can, but making sure that what we're putting in place really is going to be sustainable and provide that kind of green transition.
Well, that's music to my ears. As a prudent banker, I got to say, it's always great to have a panel like this where everyone's sensible and prudent. I'm going to wrap up now. Just a couple of closing remarks. First, to thank the panelists today. It's been a great discussion and very lively on finance and risk. I think, as we've highlighted, the investment and finance community is evolving. It's evolving rapidly. It's very, very encouraging that we're not working in silos, that there is this dialogue between regulators, government, investment community, and business community. And I really thought the point about the kind of appetite for risk, you know, these changes are not going to be made without sort of an appreciation and an acceptance of some level of risk. And there is that sort of sliding scale between risk and return, which the finance community, investment community is very good at assessing and pricing. And hopefully, you know, that will help us deliver the kind of levels of financing that are required. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Mark. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ben. That was very interesting. So my name is Mark Florence. I'm the co-chairman of the Energy and Utilities Committee at BRITCHAM, as well as the co-chair of the Sustainability Committee. So I keep relatively busy at BRITCHAM. So I also work at a fund called Climate Investor One, which is a fund of about $1 billion that offers blended financing. It's backed by the Dutch government and EU and various other institutions, which provides funding for equity funding for hard to fund projects in the renewable energy sector in Asia and Africa. So we're going to spend about a few moments, about 15 minutes now, just really looking at what the key takeaways were, drawing them out from, I think, a very content-rich session that we had for the BRITCHAM Think Tank. I think most of the speakers you've already had the opportunity to meet and listen to. I think the only exception possibly, I think, is Peter Godfrey, who is the Managing Director for APAC for the Energy Institute. And what I'll do, I'll kick off straight away, and what I'll do is I'll go through each session and just ask each of you to please summarize what you thought were the key takeaways from the discussions you had. And I'll start with Tom. And Tom, if you wouldn't mind just sort of giving us a briefing on the keynote. We seem to have lost Tom. He's in ready to go. He's chickened out. Oh, there you are.
Hi, Mark. I was just waiting for me to come on the camera. So I think my key takeaways are, I mean, I really like the points about policy certainty. And I think I would sort of echo that in terms of, you know, the UK's, what we're trying to achieve with our net zero strategy, and really looking to sort of draw in the private sector to come around that. So really good points, I think, about you know, how we do that. I really liked too the stuff about money talking. So there was some great stuff in the final session about risk, and particularly about the private sector anticipating that change through measures like the internal carbon pricing. So I mean, we see that in some of the biggest organisations here, like Temasek, for example, setting an internal carbon price on their portfolio. I think the sort of plug I would give following that is we see a sort of connection between those. So at COP, you will hear a lot about the role of the private sector, not just in sort of going into the space created by policymakers, but also about creating that pull. So one of the big efforts that we're working on is around the race to zeros, and a big initiative led by Mark Carney, our COP26 finance envoy, called the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. And we're expecting about $90 trillion worth of assets to be under that sort of net zero banner by COP. So that the ambition around that is that the private sector, all that finance, creates an incentive for the other sectors on their balance sheets to move in the right direction. So I think there's a great sort of synergy between the role of the private sector and the role of government collaborating together to achieve that change. So really good sessions. It was really great to hear them all.
No, thank you, Tom. You've always been a big supporter of BRITCHAM. It's very helpful to hear your insights. Thank you. I'll move on to the next session, which Alad, you chaired, you moderated. The energy transition and scaling up investments in Southeast Asia and sustainable infrastructure. What do you think were the key takeaways?
Well, a couple of items which strike me, and where the panelists created great added value to the audience, I believe. Number one is the cost associated with potentially retiring and replacing coal-fired power stations, which is clearly a requirement in this part of the world. There are a few countries in ASEAN which, for a better word, are still very dirty grids, and the need to basically get to a CO2 footprint reduction methodology requires innovative solutions in terms of financing in order to get there. I mean, a thermal power station takes years to develop and is very capital intensive and has normally a technical lifetime of close to 50 years. So if you're going to retire this early, or replace it with cleaner interconnectivity, baseload, low carbon energy, you need to find an innovative solution for that. And that's a role which can't be played just by the public sector. It needs to be a combination by the public and the private sector. So I think that was clearly a takeaway for me, and further development of innovative solutions as far as technologies are concerned, and particularly the input which we had on hydrogen and green hydrogen was the other key takeaway for me.
Thank you very much. The next session was on the hydrogen economy and CCUS, which I personally believe are going to be very, very important elements of the whole climate issue. Without them, I think we're not going to get to our goals. Peter, would you like to comment on this session?
Yeah, hi. And I think there were some important issues that came up around hydrogen and CCS in the earlier remarks as well, from both Tom and obviously Ofgem. Really talking about two things. One being that obviously gas and natural gas in the UK is going to remain important for some time, but you know, there is clearly a need to decarbonize gas and create long-term storage options as part of that, as well as obviously CCS being the core route. Hello, can you hear me? Sorry, I thought there was a...
Yes, I can hear you.
Very good. So I think that was very important, and an important sort of statement in terms of where things are going and where CCS and hydrogen may go. The other side of hydrogen was relevant with regard to transportation, and the fact that obviously Gareth's comment about incentivizing systems level into innovation, looking at how you fill or get rid of the cogs that are not working within a system in order to make a system work, is terribly important when one begins to start looking at a policy for how an overall system should develop. And that, of course, comes to the core comment that we made right at the beginning, which is the focus on collaboration. And collaboration being key, the need to recognize that different independent sectors and subsectors that are involved in this area are terribly important. I think another thing I'd like to just finally say, coming to the final session, but I think it was an important point, was that it's not just about governments, it's not just about organizations, but it's also about communities. And the issue of socialization, so actually getting people to understand what we're trying to do within that integrated energy systems approach, is something that perhaps we've not concentrated enough on, and something that we all need to do more effectively than we have done in the past. So those are the sort of core output that I would certainly put on the table.
Thanks, Peter. And you mentioned collaboration, and I think a lot of people have mentioned it in this whole SUE conference, but I guess what's most important is the doing, right? We collaborate, but we actually do it. And let's hope that something comes out of all this.
Yeah, well, I think it's more than collaboration. It's about pace and scale. So I think what also comes out of this is, how will we ever reach pace and scale within that integrated systems approach without collaboration? So if we're serious about increasing pace and scale, it's all about collaborating and not just doing our own thing.
Absolutely. Thank you, Peter. And the last session was on finance and risk revolution. And Nick, would you like to pick up on that and just give us your key thoughts?
Yeah, thanks, mate. I think I'd actually pick up on the last thing that Peter said. It's that collaboration and bringing it forward. And what I'm seeing, and what I think you heard in that session, is business and finance, or investment and finance community, now understands there's money to be made out of this. And as that realization spreads further and further into that community, the pace of change will accelerate. And I think the key takeaway I took from what Kahu was saying on the regulatory side of things is, we need an element of regulatory certainty coming from the governments, but that is not necessarily going to stop businesses innovating and moving forward and trying to find these solutions, because ultimately they realize they have to do it because of the social need to do it. And I think the worldwide understanding now that we need to do this for all of us, whether you're big business or the little guy. So I think that's my key takeaway, mate.
Great, thank you, Nick. We have just a couple of minutes left, so I'm going to give that time to our committee chair, the Energy Utilities Committee, Tim. And Tim is going to talk to us about what the UK can offer in the Southeast Asian Energy Transition Challenge. Big topic, Tim. We've got 3 minutes to do it.
No problem, no problem. No, I was really pleased actually that BRITCHAM came together and played a real part in Singapore International Energy Week, right across the whole week. I mean, when I look at the figures, probably 7,500 people saw events that BRITCHAM was involved in, including this. And I think that's absolutely tremendous for a chamber and the work that we've been doing this year across all of these topics. I think in this session, we were able to fill in some of the gaps as to what does collaboration really mean. We heard from Simon at Ofgem that he's willing to share experience, and particularly around interconnectivity. We heard a lot about interconnectivity this week. The region needs it to move green electrons around the system. And of course, the UK's got about 6-7 gigawatts of interconnectivity, including the world's largest interconnector that's just been finished with Norway. So we've got plenty of experience to offer the region and willing to do that. It was great to hear from the catapults who are filling that gap between the public and private sector as to how do you get innovation driven across many sectors, from high value manufacturing to transportation and to the connected places. And I think as well, we heard from Sembcorp as to what work's happening around test beds. So I'd like to say the UK is not just publishing pamphlets, it's actually walking the talk with CCUS, with hydrogen, looking at not just the technology, but the business models. And I think it's clear that it's the economics, it's the business models that are needed to bring the tech that's required into the system. But of course, it's not just sharing best practice, it's sharing what works, but also what doesn't work. And I think there's plenty of experience of that, and that's worth bringing to bear. And I think, we're very open and honest about what doesn't work in the system. And just going back, we're in a region that, of course, is very different to the West in terms of economic growth and GDP. Energy per unit of GDP is different here. So, we're starting at different places, but we are here. All of us are here in Singapore, in the region, 10 minutes from anybody who wants to tap into our expertise. And we can act as that corridor to the UK, but I don't think it's a one-way corridor. I think that corridor, there's plenty of innovation in Singapore, which could work in the UK and into Europe as well. So I think this super highway of infra tech can work in both directions. So I'm really pleased with the panel. I'd like to thank everyone who was involved in the organisation and also the participation, many more than I've mentioned above. And with that, it's a good way to finish the Singapore International Energy Week. So thank you very much, Mark, and back to you for final word.
Well, thank you, Tim. And I just echo what you said to thank all the fantastic speakers we had today. And of course, thank you to Sue for allowing us, BRITCHAM, to be involved in this amazing event. Thank you all.